This boy befriends his lonely elderly neighbor, but after she passed away, he discovers that she left a gift for him. Lucas was 11 years old when he first noticed Mrs. Adler, his mysterious, elderly neighbor. She lived alone in a small, weathered house with a creaky porch that sat in the shadow of a giant maple tree. For as long as Lucas could remember, she had been there, a silent fixture in their neighborhood. Every morning she could be seen on her porch with a thick wool blanket draped over her knees, her white hair pulled into a loose bun, her hands clasped around a mug of tea that seemed to go cold before she'd had a chance to drink it. She rarely spoke to anyone and never seemed to have visitors. To most of the neighborhood, Mrs. Adler was a shadow, a quiet, barely visible figure who faded into the background. But one autumn afternoon, something about her house drew Lucas in. The maple tree had dropped its first blanket of orange and gold leaves, covering Mrs. Adler's front yard in a brilliant, fiery carpet. As Lucas walked by, he noticed how the leaves blanketed her entire walkway, stretching up to her front steps, even spilling onto the porch itself. The mess didn't seem to bother her, as she just sat there, gazing out with that far-off look she always had. Lucas felt a pang of pity. She looked as if she'd been waiting for something or someone for a very long time. He thought of his mother's constant reminder, always help when you can. You never know what a simple kindness can mean. Lucas shifted his book bag onto his shoulder, glanced around and made a decision. He jogged back to his yard, grabbed the rake, and marched over to Mrs. Adler's house. The rhythmic scraping of his rake across the lawn seemed to break the stillness of her front yard. Lucas worked methodically, forming tidy piles as he moved. The task wasn't easy. The leaves were thick and damp in some places, but he didn't mind. It felt good to do something, especially when he thought of how lonely she seemed. As he finished up, he heard the quiet creak of the porch boards, and looked up to see Mrs. Adler watching him with a small, curious smile. Her gaze, often far off and unreachable, was focused on him now with a softness he hadn't expected. She looked almost as if she were seeing him for the first time. Not as another neighborhood kid, but as someone she wanted to know. "Thank you, Lucas," she said, her voice a little scratchy from disuse, but steady and warm. Lucas grinned, surprised and pleased that she knew his name. "You're welcome, Mrs. Adler. I thought, it looked like you could use some help." She nodded, still smiling. "That was very thoughtful of you. It's been a long time since anyone raked those leaves. I don't move quite as quickly as I used to." They stood in silence for a moment, and then, in an unexpected gesture, she waved him over to the porch, patting the spot beside her. "I don't have much to offer, but would you like a cup of tea?" He hesitated. Tea wasn't really his thing, but something about her invitation felt special. He didn't want to say no. Mrs. Adler disappeared inside and returned a few moments later with 2 steaming mugs, the fragrant aroma of chamomile filling the crisp autumn air. She handed him a cup, her hands trembling slightly, but her face calm and focused. Lucas took a sip, cringing at the unfamiliar taste, but trying not to show it. Mrs. Adler chuckled, noticing his expression. "Tea is an acquired taste, I suppose. Not everyone grows up liking it." He relaxed and took another small sip, realizing he didn't mind it as much as he'd thought. They sat in silence, watching the last of the golden light fade into evening, the sky a blend of pink and purple above them. He felt strangely at ease with her, as if he were in the presence of someone who saw and understood things he couldn't even name. After a while, she began to ask him questions, simple things at first, like his favorite subjects in school, his friends, and what he liked to do for fun. Lucas was surprised by how intently she listened. She nodded thoughtfully as he told her about his recent history test, the pet hamster he'd gotten for his birthday, and his interest in drawing. When he mentioned he wanted to be an artist one day, her eyes sparkled with interest. An artist, she leaned back thoughtfully, her gaze drifting to the trees around them. Art can reveal a lot about people, about places, even about things they keep hidden. It's a wonderful thing to want to create. He smiled shyly, unsure how to respond. No one had ever spoken to him about art with such interest or approval. As they finished their tea, Mrs. Adler reached behind her and produced a small tin. She opened it, revealing cookies neatly stacked inside, their warm, spiced scent wafting up into the cool air. She offered him one, and he eagerly accepted, biting into a cookie that tasted exactly like autumn, crisp and buttery, with a hint of cinnamon. When he finally said goodbye and headed home, Mrs. Adler gave him a gentle wave, a content smile on her face. It was only later, lying in bed, that he realized she had made him feel important, like his stories and dreams mattered. That simple afternoon on her porch had left a warmth in his heart, a feeling he couldn't quite explain. After that day, Lucas found himself drawn to her house more often. He'd look for small reasons to stop by, sometimes offering to carry her grocery bags or bringing her one of his latest drawings. Mrs. Adler welcomed him each time, inviting him onto her porch or into her cozy living room, where everything seemed frozen in time. Her home was filled with relics of the past: antique clocks, faded photographs, and an old leather-bound journal she kept by her armchair. She never spoke much about her past, but Lucas felt a deep history in every detail of her home. One drizzly afternoon, he noticed a photograph on her coffee table that he hadn't seen before. It was a small, black-and-white picture of a man in a military uniform, standing tall and serious, with Mrs. Adler beside him, much younger but unmistakably her. There was a quiet pride in her expression as she looked up at him, a look Lucas imagined you might have if you were standing next to a hero. "Is that your husband?" he asked, curiosity getting the better of him. She glanced at the photograph, her expression softening. "Yes, that's Henry. He was the most wonderful man I ever knew." Lucas didn't press her for details, but over the following weeks, she began sharing little pieces of her life with him. Henry, she told him, had been a carpenter, a skilled craftsman who could turn simple pieces of wood into beautiful furniture. She showed him an old armchair he had made, its wood smooth and worn from years of use. She even let him sit in it, smiling as he carefully settled into its familiar shape. "He built most of the furniture in this house," she said, a hint of pride in her voice. "Every piece has a story, and each one reminds me of him." Lucas listened, entranced, feeling as though he were learning about a time he could barely imagine. Henry had loved jazz music, she said, and sometimes they'd dance in the kitchen, just the two of them, spinning around while the record player crackled in the background. Her eyes would grow misty as she told these stories, her voice soft with memory. Sometimes she'd hum a few lines of a song, her voice thin and wavering but filled with emotion. Lucas would sit quietly, not wanting to interrupt the moment, just listening as she drifted into a world that seemed to exist only in her mind. These stories left a deep impression on him, and he found himself thinking of Henry as if he, too, were part of his life, a silent presence, felt but never seen. As the weeks passed, Lucas's visits became routine. His mother noticed, smiling whenever she saw him leaving the house with a fresh drawing or an apple from their backyard for Mrs. Adler. She was glad he had taken to visiting her, and she often encouraged him to help with small things, reminding him that it was important to be kind to those who didn't have family around. One day, when Lucas arrived after school, he found Mrs. Adler sitting by the window, gazing out with an expression of such deep sadness that he almost didn't want to disturb her. But when she saw him, her face brightened, and she waved him in, patting the seat beside her. "I'm glad you're here, Lucas," she said, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. "It's been a lonely day." He didn't know what to say, but he squeezed her hand back, hoping it would be enough. She smiled, a little teary-eyed, and he could feel her gratitude without needing any more words. They sat together, looking out the window, as if sharing a silent understanding that, in that moment, they were each other's company. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, Lucas began to notice something different about Mrs. Adler's house. While every other home on the street glowed with lights and decorations, hers remained quiet and dark, without a single wreath or strand of garland. He couldn't understand it. He knew she loved Christmas. She had told him stories about the holiday traditions she used to keep, the way she and Henry would decorate their tree, and how her children would pile around the fireplace, singing carols in matching pajamas. Lucas couldn't imagine her house without a bit of holiday cheer. One chilly December afternoon, he decided to ask her about it. They were sitting in her living room, watching a quiet snow fall through the frosted window. The only light in the room came from the small fire crackling in the fireplace, casting a soft, warm glow across Mrs. Adler's face. She looked serene, almost lost in thought, as she sipped her tea, her fingers wrapped tightly around the mug. "Mrs. Adler, why don't you put up any Christmas decorations?" he asked gently. "I could help you, if you want." She gave him a wistful smile, her eyes softening. "I suppose I haven't decorated in years, Lucas. Not since it was just me here." Lucas didn't know what to say. He could sense that she was thinking of the family she no longer had by her side. He reached out, giving her hand a reassuring pat. "We could at least do a tree. It doesn't have to be big. I could bring one over and we could make it really nice. Maybe even some lights for the porch." Mrs. Adler's gaze lingered on him, and for a moment he thought he saw her hesitate, as if she were about to say yes. But then, she shook her head slowly. "Thank you, Lucas. It's very sweet of you. But I think I'll just enjoy watching everyone else's lights this year." Lucas felt a pang of disappointment. But he nodded, not wanting to push her. Still, he couldn't get the image of her dark, lonely house out of his mind. When he got home that night, he hatched a plan. After a quick rummage through his family's holiday storage boxes, he found a string of twinkling white lights and a small bag of red ribbon. He tucked them into his backpack, determined to give her porch a little cheer. The next afternoon, when Mrs. Adler was out at her weekly grocery run, Lucas snuck over to her house. He carefully strung the lights along the porch railing, looping them around the posts and finishing them off with small bows he'd made from the red ribbon. As he stepped back to admire his work, he felt a surge of pride. The lights weren't much, but they added a touch of warmth, casting a cozy glow over her front steps. He hoped it would bring her some holiday spirit, even if it was just a small gesture. That evening, he waited for her reaction. As he saw her car pull into the driveway, he slipped out of sight, watching from a distance as she approached the house. She paused on the sidewalk, her eyes wide as she took in the lights, her hand flying to her mouth. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, the glow illuminating her face in a soft, golden hue. Her expression shifted from surprise to something deeper, an emotion Lucas couldn't quite name but felt all the same. When she finally looked away, her eyes seemed misty, her smile gentle and full of something like gratitude. She looked around as if searching for him, and then whispered, "Thank you, Lucas," though he was too far away to hear. The next day, Mrs. Adler surprised him with an invitation. "Would you come over and help me with something?" she asked. "I've decided. I'd like to put up a small tree after all." Lucas couldn't contain his excitement. He ran back home, gathering a few old ornaments and a small set of lights his family could spare, then returned to her house, where she had already brought down a tiny artificial tree from her attic. It looked a bit worn, but to Lucas, it was perfect. They spent the afternoon decorating, Mrs. Adler showing him each ornament she'd kept over the years. There were glass baubles that had belonged to her mother, a set of wooden animals her children had made, and even a small silver angel that Henry had given her their first Christmas together. As they worked, she shared stories, her voice full of nostalgia and warmth. "I remember one Christmas," she began, smiling as she held a delicate, hand-painted ornament. "Henry was determined to surprise me with a new kitchen table. He spent weeks working on it, sneaking out to the garage after I'd gone to bed. I didn't know a thing until Christmas morning. When I saw it, I nearly cried." Lucas could almost picture it, the laughter and excitement filling their little house. By the time they finished decorating, the tree looked beautiful, its lights casting soft patterns across the room, illuminating the old photographs and cherished mementos scattered around her living room. Lucas felt a warmth in his heart, as if he'd been invited to share in something sacred and private. He'd never felt so close to someone outside his family. That night, as he walked home through the snow, he thought about all the stories she had shared with him, each one weaving a new thread of connection between them. He felt as if he were part of her past now, as if he were carrying a piece of her life forward with him. From that day on, they spent more time together than ever, Mrs. Adler seemed lighter, her steps quicker, and her laugh more frequent. She even joined his family for Christmas dinner, bringing a homemade pumpkin pie that everyone agreed was the best they'd ever tasted. She laughed with his parents, shared jokes with his little brother, and gave Lucas a soft, knitted scarf she had made herself. The evening felt like a small miracle, a moment of unexpected joy in the heart of winter. In the days that followed, Lucas found himself looking forward to each visit with her. Each story she shared, each small, quiet moment in her company. Little did he know, those precious hours together would soon become even more valuable than he could ever imagine. As winter settled in and the neighborhood lay quiet under a blanket of snow, Lucas's visits with Mrs. Adler became more regular. He'd finish his homework as quickly as he could each day, then bundle up in his thickest scarf and hat, carrying over a thermos of hot chocolate to share. Mrs. Adler would greet him at the door with a warm smile, her home cozy and lit by the soft glow of lamps, each room steeped in quiet comfort. One afternoon they sat by the fire as usual, sipping hot chocolate and watching snowflakes drift lazily past the window. As they talked, Lucas noticed a faint melody playing in the background, something soft and jazzy, the kind of music that made you think of candle-lit rooms and whispered conversations. He looked over at Mrs. Adler, who was humming along with the song, her eyes bright and dreamy. "Do you like jazz, Lucas?" she asked, noticing his interest. Lucas shrugged. "I don't know much about it, but it sounds nice. Relaxing." Mrs. Adler's face lit up. "Henry and I used to listen to jazz almost every night. It was one of his favorites. After the kids were in bed, he'd put on a record, and we'd dance around the living room. Sometimes he'd make up silly moves just to make me laugh. He was quite the dancer, you know." She chuckled, lost in the memory, and Lucas couldn't help but smile along with her. It was as if the warmth of that memory filled the room, wrapping around them like a soft blanket. He imagined Mrs. Adler, young and carefree, twirling around her living room with Henry, both of them laughing, their world filled with music and love. "I wish I could have met him," Lucas said softly. "He sounds like someone everyone would like." Mrs. Adler looked at him, her eyes misting over. "He would have liked you, Lucas. He had a special place in his heart for young people. He used to say that they're the ones who bring hope into the world. Just by being here, you remind me of him." Lucas felt a warm glow spread through him. It was a strange feeling, like he'd somehow been entrusted with something precious. He glanced around her living room, noticing all the small details that made it feel so familiar: the old armchair that had once belonged to Henry, the worn record player in the corner, the shelf filled with books she had read over the years. Her life, he realized, was a tapestry of memories, woven together by love and loss, joy and heartache. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Adler shared more stories about Henry, about the house they had made a home, and the life they'd built together. Sometimes, when the stories touched a particularly tender memory, her voice would grow soft and her gaze would drift away, as if she were looking at something only she could see. Lucas listened intently, feeling as though he were being given a glimpse into a world he'd never known, a world of laughter, resilience, and quiet courage. One evening, just as February was drawing to a close, Mrs. Adler surprised him with an old photograph. It showed her and Henry on their wedding day, standing outside a small chapel, her arm looped through his, both of them beaming at the camera. Mrs. Adler looked so young, her face glowing with happiness, her eyes full of hope. Lucas stared at the photograph, feeling a swell of admiration for the life they had shared, for the love that had endured even after Henry's passing. "You look so happy," he murmured, his voice full of awe. Mrs. Adler smiled, her gaze soft. "We were. It wasn't always easy, but we were happy. Happiness, I think, is something you have to work at. It doesn't just appear, you have to build it, piece by piece." Lucas nodded, trying to absorb her words. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling softly, the photograph resting between them like a quiet reminder of all that had come before. As spring began to arrive, Lucas noticed that Mrs. Adler seemed to be growing weaker. She moved more slowly, often pausing to catch her breath, and sometimes he'd catch her dozing off even in the middle of a conversation. He didn't want to worry her by asking if she was all right, so he simply started helping more, taking out her trash, bringing her groceries, and making sure there was enough wood stacked up to keep her fireplace going. One rainy afternoon, after he had run a few errands for her, Mrs. Adler thanked him, reaching for his hand with a gentle squeeze. "You're a good friend, Lucas. It's rare to find kindness like yours in this world. I want you to know that your visits have brought more light to my days than you'll ever realize." Her words struck him deeply, and he nodded, unable to find the right words to reply. He knew his visits meant a lot to her, but hearing it directly from her filled him with a profound sense of gratitude. He squeezed her hand in return, hoping she could feel just how much she meant to him, too. Then, one weekend in early April, Lucas returned from a short trip with his family and eagerly went to Mrs. Adler's house, excited to tell her all about the little seaside town they had visited. But when he knocked, there was no answer. A strange feeling crept over him, a heaviness settling in his chest as he peered through her window, seeing only the stillness of her empty living room. When he told his mother, she made a few calls, and by the next morning, Lucas learned that Mrs. Adler had been taken to the hospital. His heart felt heavy with worry and confusion. He wanted to visit her, to let her know he was there, but the hospital was far, and his mother explained that she needed rest. Days went by without any news, and Lucas could hardly focus on school, his thoughts constantly drifting to Mrs. Adler, hoping she was all right. Finally, one evening, his mother sat him down with a look of sorrow in her eyes. She told him gently that Mrs. Adler had passed away in her sleep, peacefully, without pain. The news hit him like a stone dropped into deep water, sending ripples of sadness through him that seemed endless. Over the next few days, Lucas felt a strange emptiness. He walked past her house each afternoon, half expecting to see her sitting on the porch, smiling as she waited for him. But the house was quiet, its windows dark, and he felt the loss keenly, as if a part of his world had gone dark with her passing. One afternoon, as he sat in his room, lost in thought, a letter arrived at his home, addressed to him in a shaky but familiar handwriting. His heart leapt as he opened it, holding his breath as he recognized Mrs. Adler's voice in the words on the page. The letter was short, but it overflowed with warmth and gratitude. She thanked him for the friendship he'd given her, for the kindness that had filled her last years with joy and comfort. She called him her dear friend. And at the end she'd written, "I hope I've left something for you that will remind you of the laughter we shared." A few days later, her lawyer reached out to Lucas's family, explaining that Mrs. Adler had left something for him in her will. When they arrived at the office, Lucas could hardly believe what he was hearing. She had left him her old typewriter, the very one she had used to write letters to her husband during the war, and to keep journals of the stories she had told him over the months. In the days that followed, Lucas spent hours with that typewriter, tapping away as he tried to capture the memories she'd shared, her life preserved in the words that he would write just for her. And as he wrote, he felt a warmth fill his heart. A small but steady reminder that kindness, once shared, never truly leaves us. In the days that followed, Lucas found himself spending countless hours in his room, fingers clacking away on Mrs. Adler's old typewriter. Its keys, though a bit stiff from age, felt solid and sure beneath his hands, as if it held all her memories within its mechanisms, waiting for him to unlock them. Each letter he pressed reminded him of her voice, her laugh, the way her stories had filled the quiet rooms of her home with life. The words came slowly at first, but once he began, it was as if he couldn't stop. He started by writing down the things she had told him, the stories of her and Henry dancing to jazz music in their little living room, the pride she had felt watching her children grow, and the holiday traditions they had shared as a family. Every detail was precious, a piece of her life that he felt responsible for preserving. At school, he carried around a small notebook, jotting down thoughts and memories as they came to him, so he wouldn't lose a single detail. His teachers noticed a change in him. He was quieter, more introspective, though there was a certain light in his eyes when he talked about his writing. Even his friends grew curious, asking what he was always scribbling down, and he would tell them about Mrs. Adler in bits and pieces, careful to do her justice. One evening, As he was typing out a particularly beautiful memory, she had shared how Henry had once serenaded her in front of a crowded cafe during a rainstorm. Completely soaked but grinning ear to ear, Lucas's mother came in, carrying a small cardboard box. "Lucas," she said softly, setting the box on his bed, "this came for you today. It's from Mrs. Adler's house." Lucas looked up, his fingers still on the typewriter keys. He stared at the box, feeling a strange mix of excitement and sadness. With a nod, he set his hands aside and opened it, gently removing the lid. Inside were a few carefully wrapped items, each one wrapped in tissue paper. The first thing he unwrapped was a framed photograph of her and Henry on their wedding day, the same one she'd shown him that winter evening by the fire. She looked young, radiant, her face glowing with happiness as she gazed at the man who had once filled her life with love. He placed the photo on his desk, right beside the typewriter, feeling a surge of gratitude. Next, he found a small music box with a delicate rose pattern carved into the lid. When he opened it, a familiar melody filled the room, soft, slow, and jazzy, just like the songs Mrs. Adler used to hum. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him, feeling as if he were back in her living room, sipping tea and listening to her stories. It was like she was there with him, her presence wrapped around him like a warm blanket. At the bottom of the box was a stack of yellowed papers tied together with a faded ribbon. He untied it carefully, reading the note she'd left on top: "For Lucas, my own memories, so you'll know even the parts I didn't share." His heart thudded as he flipped through the pages, each one filled with Mrs. Adler's beautiful, looping handwriting. These were her stories, her own childhood memories, her thoughts about life, her dreams and regrets. She had written about Henry, about her children, even about her own quiet days after they'd all gone. And she'd written about him too, about the boy who had brought light and laughter back into her life when she needed it most. Lucas read until his eyes grew tired, until the words blurred and ran together, but he couldn't stop. Each page held a piece of her heart, each sentence a reminder of the woman who had shared her life so openly with him. He felt honored, humbled, as if she had left him with a priceless gift, a legacy he was now part of. Days turned into weeks, and Lucas continued writing, using her notes and memories to bring her stories to life on the typewriter. He wrote about her with a depth and tenderness he hadn't known he was capable of, and each time he hit a difficult part, a memory of her loss, or a moment of sadness, he reminded himself that he was writing this for her, as a way to honor the life she had lived. When he finally finished, he felt a mixture of relief and pride, a sense that he had done justice to the incredible woman who had changed his life. He put the pages together, tied them up with a ribbon, and placed them next to the music box and photograph on his desk. Later that week, he invited his parents into his room, and he read a few of the stories aloud to them. They listened quietly, his mother wiping away tears, his father nodding thoughtfully, their faces full of love and pride. When he finished, his mother wrapped him in a tight hug, her voice thick with emotion. "I think Mrs. Adler would be so proud of you, Lucas," she whispered. "You've kept her memory alive in such a beautiful way." In the weeks that followed, Lucas shared the stories with a few of Mrs. Adler's old friends and neighbors, people who remembered her as the quiet woman on the porch, but didn't know the vibrant life she had led. Each time he shared a piece of her story, he felt her presence beside him, as if she were standing there, smiling with approval. As spring turned to summer, Lucas still felt her absence, but he also felt a deep sense of peace. He had done what he could to honor her memory, to keep her stories alive, and in doing so, he'd found a new purpose for himself. He no longer saw himself just as a kid with big dreams of becoming an artist. Now he was someone who knew the power of words, the magic of a story well told, and the incredible impact that one person's kindness could have on another's life. Mrs. Adler had left him with more than her typewriter, her photograph, and her stories. She had left him with a piece of herself, a legacy of love, resilience, and joy that he would carry with him forever. And as he sat by the open window, feeling the warm summer breeze on his face, he knew that he would always be grateful for the autumn afternoon when he had decided to rake her leaves, and for the friendship that had bloomed from that simple act of kindness. Because of her, he understood that sometimes the greatest gifts we receive aren't the ones wrapped in ribbons or written in wills, but the memories we carry forward, the lives we honor by simply remembering.